Hello, everyone. I'm Daz, and welcome to American Civil War and UK History Podcast. This presentation is available as a video on our YouTube channel or as a podcast from wherever you get your podcasts from. And if you're watching on YouTube, remember to hit the subscribe button and give us a big thumbs up. And to keep up to date with everything American Civil War and UK history, check out our website where you'll find blog posts, links to all of our podcasts, social media pages. The link is in the podcast description. And joining me today is Jim Hessler, who is an author, as well as a Gettysburg National Battlefield licensed battlefield guide. That was a bit of a mouthful, wasn't it? I made that harder than it should have been. And host of the Battle of Gettysburg podcast. Welcome, Jim.
Hey, thanks for the invite, and really appreciate you having me here. It's I've done a lot of podcasts and stuff, but I feel like I'm finally reaching across the pond, so I think this is great to tell the story of Dan Sickles.
Oh, yes, thanks. Yeah, and you're very popular over here, actually, within the round table, I'll tell you that.
Oh.
So, yeah, I think we should try and get you over at some point. We'll figure something out.
I wasn't going to say that, but since you mentioned it, yeah, where is my invite? I know my podcast partner, Eric, has been invited over, but mine must have got lost in the mail or something like that.
I'll have a look around, mate, and try and find it. Anyway, before we look at Dan Sickles, or Uncle Dan, as many people call him, could you please tell us first, because it is your first time on the American Civil War and UK history, how did you become interested in history?
In history, yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that. My background, my educational and professional background is actually business and finance. So unlike a lot of people in this field, I'm not an academic. I don't work for the Park Service or a college or anything like that. I don't know so much when I became interested in history. I've actually always had an interest in some specific topics, one of which was Custer in the Battle of the Little Bighorn, which for whatever reason, I've been interested in that my whole life. Eventually, though, about 30 years or so ago, that sort of transitioned into an interest in the American Civil War. Like that was probably about 1990, 91, I became more interested in the Civil War. And it feels kind of lightweight to say that, by the way, as one of my cats opens the door behind me here. It feels kind of lightweight to say, well, 1990s, but then you look at the calendar and realize, hey, that was 35 years ago. So I became interested in the Civil War. Eventually, my family and I did move to beautiful Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. I became a licensed battlefield guide here in about 2003. And at that particular time, I found that I liked telling Dan Sickles stories, and one thing led to the other. I'll pause there to let you kind of interject, but kind of what brings us here today.
Yeah, thanks for that, mate. Appreciate that. And okay, then let's talk about Dan Sickles. So, could you please give us a little brief history on Dan Sickles before the American Civil War?
Before the Civil War, sure. So, I always sort of thumbnail Dan Sickles by saying he is three things that a lot of people don't like all rolled up into one guy. He's a former attorney, he's a former congressman, and he's a New Yorker. Again, three things that can be polarizing to a lot of people. But Dan Sickles was born in October of 1819, which would have made him about 44 years old at the Battle of Gettysburg. Again, New York City native. He was born and raised as an only child to, fairly wealthy parents in the New York City area. And most biographers tend to think that this sort of made him a rather spoiled and perhaps self-indulged individual, really for his entire life, probably something that he never completely grew out of. There are stories in his youth that he rebelled against authority. They maybe had trouble finding schools that could contain young Dan Sickles, and things of that nature. Eventually, he became sort of an attorney. Back in the days when the law profession was not quite as rigorous as it is today to study for, but he became an attorney, and eventually, by probably about the 1840s or so, early 1850s, became embroiled in New York City's Tammany Hall politics. For anybody who may not be familiar with that, Tammany Hall was a Democrat powerhouse in New York City that has also been notorious for kickbacks, bribes, corruption. that sort of thing during the era. But by the 1850s, Dan Sickles was considered a rising star in New York politics. He had a young wife, Teresa, who he married. Perhaps we'll talk about that story a little bit later. And eventually, by the late 1850s, was elected to Congress and seemed to have a very bright future when 1859 rolled around, and that bright future came crashing down. And again, I will pause there, Darren, and see if, before we go on, if you have any questions.
Yeah, so obviously, just before the Civil War, he's quite famous for something that happens in DC. Is that correct? So, would you like to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so that was the I alluded to that in the last answer. When the Sickleses arrived in Washington D.C., Dan had married a young friend of the family, a woman by the name of Teresa Baggioli, who was about 16 years or so younger than he was. And by most accounts, it was probably a stormy, I would think also probably a rather passionate marriage, emotional. But when they arrived in Washington, Dan Sickles, if I didn't mention, was a well-known womanizer and ladies' man. And Teresa started having an affair with a friend of Dan's, which was a prominent district attorney in Washington by the name of Philip Barton Key. Philip Barton Key was the son of our very own Francis Scott Key, who had written the Star-Spangled Banner. And Teresa and Philip Barton embarked on this affair, which was very much secret at first, but after several months had passed by, pretty much became the talk of Washington, D.C. Dan Sickles did not find out about the affair again until late February of 1859. And when he did, he had extracted a confession from Teresa, and the following Sunday afternoon, he confronted Philip Barton Key in Lafayette Square, Lafayette Park, which is literally right behind our White House, and after a brief struggle, had shot Key dead. Now, Sickles and Key, prior to this, had been friends, both men very prominent in Washington society. So you can imagine something like this: a murder, the scandal, the affair created a great scandal within the Washington society. Congressman Sickles essentially turned himself in and assembled this legal dream team, this big show trial that got all kinds of newspaper coverage, media sensation, and that sort of thing. And eventually Congressman Sickles was acquitted. He got off from murdering Key, but that trial and the bad publicity from it really did change the trajectory of Sickles's life and career, and ultimately was one of the factors that led him down the road of becoming a general in the American Civil War.
Yeah, I'd like to touch on that a little bit, actually, about how he becomes involved with the Army of the Potomac and how he becomes a general, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. So I mentioned Sickles had gotten off. He had been acquitted of the crime. The crime itself has been remembered in the American judicial system as sort of the first temporary insanity defense ever used by an American court. But there's a fair amount of debate over whether or not that's more accurate. But that's how it's been remembered. Public opinion at that time was initially very much in Dan Sickles' favor. The idea that he was protecting his wife and his home from this lecherous adulterer, who also happened to be a friend of his, pretty much, as I said, had initially put public opinion in Sickles' favor. However, after the trial, he then reconciled with Teresa. And the bad publicity from the idea of him reconciling with, this bad woman, as she was referred to, really torpedoed any goodwill that the public had for Sickles, such that by the time you go from 1859 into 1860 and then the spring of 1861, Sickles had decided not to run for re-election in Congress and kind of just ran out his last days in Washington. So by the spring of 1861, when the American Civil War starts, the generally accepted story is he was back home in New York, practicing law as a private citizen, still well known to the public mind, a disgraced ex-congressman, but he started to give speeches, recruitment speeches. He had felt betrayed by the secession of the Southern Democrats and such. He eventually raised a regiment and then eventually a brigade in New York, what we refer to as the Excelsior Brigade. But he had raised troops in New York. Supposedly, President Lincoln, needing support for this unpopular war effort, pretty much came around and kind of said, at least the story is, Lincoln took a liking to Sickles, the aggressive spirit. Hey, I need Democrats. I need New York support, all of that stuff. And with that, it's generally believed that Lincoln helped enable Sickles's rise into what's going to become the Army of the Potomac. Sickles himself said he only joined the Army really to serve as a high private, which is kind of ridiculous to think about Private Dan Sickles. But eventually he would have been colonel of one of the regiments he raised. Lincoln, though, helps push him up to brigadier general. And then, he's going to go to higher levels beyond that by the time you get to Gettysburg. How much of that is true? It's a great story, though, and a great example of the rise of political generals in the Civil War and how much Lincoln needed to reach across the aisle to other people. So, folks, you get a guy like Dan Sickles, no military training, a rather scandalous background, pretty much being promoted for political and maybe some personal reasons, and a guy who had once been accused of more or less being mad emotionally when he murdered a guy on the streets of Washington. You think about that, and if there's more appointments like that out there, then it's no wonder the Army of the Potomac is really struggling to win battles during those opening months in the first 2 years of the Civil War.
Yeah, some great points there, mate. Really good. And so we are going to sort of fast track a little bit to a couple of days before Gettysburg.
Sure.
So obviously George Meade is appointed commander of the Army of the Potomac.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what is Dan's view on George Meade's appointment? Because there's sort of like a little clique, isn't there?
There is, and I'm glad you mentioned that because I think, one of the things I tried to do in my work and my, the Sickles book, I've done 3 books. My first book was Sickles at Gettysburg, and that book is close to 15 years or so old now. But when I first started doing the research, what I often found with interpretation was always a very simple George Meade, the West Pointer, versus Dan Sickles, the non-West Pointer. And, Sickles screwed up because he didn't have quote unquote professional training. And if only he had listened to the professional training of George Meade, none of this would have happened. There's no doubt that some of that is true, but when I first started getting into the story, I found a more complicated and, to me, a more personally interesting version than that. Because what you find in the late winter of 1862, the early winter of 1863, as you referred, Darren, there are cliques. There are cliques within the Army of the Potomac, social cliques, yes, West Pointers versus non-West Pointers. Sickles was in a clique basically headed by Joe Hooker, who is commander of the Army before Meade is, as well as Chief of Staff, there they are, Chief of Staff Dan Butterfield, who had previously commanded in the Fifth Corps. These 3 guys, generally, and I'm going to simplify here in the interest of time, but generally known as drinkers, womanizers to a different extent, and guys who just like to have a good time. These 3 guys, and Hooker's running the Army, so, if you're in with Hooker, you're in with the cool kids. These 3 guys really have this social clique that kind of controls the Army. And among the officers who are excluded is George Meade. George is more of a family man. He doesn't like to party the way the other guys do. And if you've ever read Meade's letters, his life and letters, you see several references to this idea of, hey, everybody had a party last night and nobody invited me, kind of thing. So there was a social gap between Meade and Sickles, which set off some bad blood. Meade also had some bad blood in the Third Corps of the Army of the Potomac because Meade and one of the division commanders, a guy by the name of David Birney, had a little dispute over lack of support after Fredericksburg. Birney and Sickles are friends, so you got that dynamic going for you. So the point that I'm trying to make is You had two guys who didn't like each other. They didn't work well together. They're not going to communicate well with each other. And again, it's more than just West Point versus non-West Point. It's this background that goes into the months leading up to Gettysburg. And I think that's important. You know, battles and history, they're about the people and the personalities who do it. And, you know, too often we just make it about terrain and tactics and West Point and all of that stuff.
Hmm. But also, you're dealing with somebody with such a massive ego like Dan, but also like, I mean, Meade himself is quite sort of, it's just the way he is, you know. Do you know what I'm trying to say? I'm sorry.
Well,
Words.
well, yeah, you know, Meade is a complex guy,
Yeah, that's
right?
what I mean. Yeah.
And again today, what you're starting to see more of in the Gettysburg literature is sort of the stereotype that Meade is quiet, unassuming, and very often overlooked by historians. But you know, Meade is a complicated guy, like we all are, like everybody. And you're right, he's very different from Dan Sickles. Meade is more of a family man. He has that temper. You know, he's not Saint George Meade. He has that temper. You know, they called him the old snapping turtle for a reason. But nevertheless, he is definitely not somebody who's going to get along with Dan Sickles and vice versa. And so I think you see examples of that from the moment Meade takes command on June 28th, again, right up until these two guys have this sort of spectacular collision on the battlefield on July 2nd.
Okay, let's talk about the Third Corps and its background, and how does Dan actually end up becoming the commander of the Third Corps in the first place, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. You know, Hooker plays a big part of that, whether it be directly or indirectly. Obviously, Joe Hooker, Fighting Joe, as he was erroneously known, because Hooker is sort of a rising star from, oh, let's say middle of 1862 until middle of 1863. Kind of when Hooker gets promoted, Sickles rises behind him in his rank, division commander, and then ultimately when Hooker is promoted to command the Army of the Potomac during that early late 62, early 1863, prior to Chancellorsville. When Hooker is ordered to command Army of the Potomac, Sickles receives command of the Third Corps after that. And so it is an example of, in my opinion, Sickles going through the ranks from brigade to division to corps command, really not getting a lot of combat experience in between. And it's specifically that sort of period where spring, let's say the fall of 1862 to about the spring of 1863. You have a couple of these big battles where Dan Sickles does not get a whole lot of combat experience. Antietam, Second Manassas in late 62. Sickles is away on recruiting duty. Fredericksburg in the winter of 1862, the Third Corps doesn't see a whole lot of combat. And the reason I'm bringing all of this up isn't just to recite his resume and kind of do a dry recitation of what he did or that sort of thing, but I think it's a good example of if Sickles had had more combat experience at lower levels, he may have been better prepared when he received command of the Third Corps prior to Chancellorsville, because, you know, they often treat Sickles as an they meaning historians and Civil War pundits, they often treat Sickles as an idiot, a guy who didn't know what he was doing. May or may not be true, but go look at his resume, folks, for his entire life, political, diplomatic, military career. If this guy was an idiot, I would challenge any of us in the audience, including me, to even have a fraction of his resume. So long answer to your question, Darren. Bottom line is he's commanding the Third Corps at the Battle of Chancellorsville in May of 1863. Ton of combat at Chancellorsville, of course. The Third Corps is one of the corps in the Army of the Potomac that really takes it on the chin at Chancellorsville. So he does get that experience, but I think obviously, like a lot of people, he would have been better served if he had had a little more leading up to it.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Yeah. What I would love to know is their journey to Gettysburg itself. So the Third Corps' journey in particular, is that something you could explain to us?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So the map that we're looking at on screen here. So if we can kind of look at, I'll kind of pick up the journey of the Third Corps with which much of the Army of the Potomac kind of coming out of Frederick, Maryland, which I see is almost about kind of the top center of this map here. Sickles, I should point out, was away from the Army of the Potomac prior to this. Sickles had suffered a slight wound at Chancellorsville, and he was away for the Army of the Potomac for a little bit. So he kind of arrived back with the Army on June 28th, literally on the same train that is carrying Meade's orders to take command of the Army. Prior to that, while he was away, David Birney, who I had mentioned before as one of the division commanders, was leading the Third Corps in Sickles' absence. But anyways, the Third Corps, when Meade takes command and gets the Army moving, which I think is one of his great accomplishments compared to what Hooker was doing. But when Meade gets the Army of the Potomac moving, you will see the Third Corps essentially kind of coming through that area, Taneytown, over to Emmitsburg. Because what's going to happen June 28th, June 29th, June 30th, Meade will put command of what we'll call the left wing of the Army of the Potomac under General John Reynolds, and that will include Reynolds' First Corps, Sickles' Third Corps, Oliver Howard's 11th Corps, and as the left of the Army, Sickles and the Third Corps in particular are going to be assigned to Emmitsburg, which, as you can see on the map, is just below the Pennsylvania-Maryland state line there. This is going to cause a little bit of confusion and a little bit of problems because Sickles will feel like he's getting some conflicting orders on the march from both General Reynolds and General Meade, and I think is really going to be one of these initial moments where, at least now in hindsight, you can go back and look at the record and the message traffic and say, okay, these guys are going to have a hard time working well together and communicating with each other, and as fate has it, they do.
Okay, thank you, mate. Okay, so we do get to Gettysburg, and of course, so they don't actually technically arrive until the morning of 2nd July, is that, or do they arrive on the evening? Sorry, 1st
Yeah,
July.
no, yeah. So Sickles himself, Birney's division, most of the Third Corps is going to start to arrive in the evening of July 1st. So they are not on the field for the first day's battle. They are in Emmitsburg. Most of them are in Emmitsburg in that vicinity. And again, between Reynolds telling Sickles to come up to Gettysburg, Howard telling Sickles to come up to Gettysburg, but indications that Meade is still telling Sickles to hold Emmitsburg. Did I say that? I might have flipped that wrong. Reynolds tells Sickles to come to Gettysburg. Howard tells Sickles to come to Gettysburg. I'm not sure if I said Emmitsburg there or not, but Gettysburg. And then again, Meade kind of telling Sickles to stay in Emmitsburg. A little bit of confusion on Sickles' part. He doesn't get on the road until afternoon of July 1st. He and the Third Corps will arrive in the early evening hours. The rest of the Third Corps will kind of trickle in for the rest of that night. So most of them get in on July 1st. He's going to leave a couple brigades, though, and some artillery back in Emmitsburg, and they will not arrive on the field until the morning of July 2nd. And you can argue whether or not any of these movements will kind of influence his subsequent decisions.
Okay, thanks for that. Yeah, and so we do get to obviously July the 2nd, and could you tell us the orders that George Meade gives to Dan Sickles himself on that morning, please?
Sure. So the communications from Meade to Sickles seem to be almost exclusively verbal. There are no surviving written orders from Meade to Sickles, and there's no indication that those orders ever were in writing. Verbal. So what seems to have happened is sometime after Meade arrives, which is give or take in the 1 a.m. hours on the morning of July 2nd, 1863. At some point, Meade is going to give Sickles verbal instructions to essentially occupy the left end of the Cemetery Ridge position, somewhat like we see on the map here with kind of the dotted line that says Sickles. That would have taken Sickles down south, down Cemetery Ridge, and more or less occupying a range of hills that we know today as Little Round Top. George Meade later described the orders, and I'm using Meade's version of it from the Committee of the Conduct of the War testimony, given under oath by George Meade in the spring of 1864. And I'm using this version of it because A, it's probably one of the earliest, if not the earliest version we have. B, Meade said it under oath. And C, other authors and historians like to sort of twist the description of the orders to fit their agenda. What Meade says under oath is basically two or threefold. He says he tells Sickles to essentially stretch, occupy, extend the left of the Second Corps, where you see Hancock on the map, extend the left of the Second Corps, occupy that range of hills, plainly visible, which again we know today is the Round Tops, and also replace some 12th Corps troops who had spent the night before around Little Round Top. So do those three things. And now in his testimony, Meade does add the phrase, if practicable, to occupy it. It doesn't mean he told Sickles, if practicable, on the battlefield, because we don't know. But in Meade's testimony description, he does use that phrase. And that is how George Meade really describes the orders to Dan Sickles. And those are the three things he's telling Sickles to do.
Okay. And so what decision does Sickles make? Would you like to explain that, please?
Sure. So as the sun comes up on that historic morning of July 2nd, Sickles and some of his officers, including his chief of artillery, start to examine the battlefield. Sickles will later say, first of all, he's not sure where those 12th Corps troops were that he was supposed to replace, because from about 5 a.m. to 7 a.m., before I think Sickles is really on the ground and looking around, the 12th Corps troops left and were basically sent over to Culp's Hill. Now, a staff officer said, well, we waited around for a while. Nobody from the 3rd Corps came to replace us, and we just left. And a lot of Sickles critics will go, aha! Well, I don't know. To me, that doesn't mean a whole hell of a lot. But in any event, that's part of Sickles's thinking. 12th Corps. I don't know where the 12th Corps was. Beyond that, though, Sickles is, and this is, look, and I'm a battlefield guy to Gettysburg. You know, I write a Sickles book. I talk about Sickles. I go onto the field where he made the decisions, because a lot of people write books, but, you know, as a battlefield guide, you're on that field hundreds of times a year looking at the ground and trying to recreate what happened. Sickles's line, the lower end of his line, has very poor fields of fire. Very, very limited room for maneuverability. Sickles is, I think, going to be concerned that if the Confederates kind of come sweeping around Devil's Den, the House Ridge area, his left flank could be vulnerable. So he doesn't like the low ground leading up to Little Round Top. But if you move north then, kind of more towards where the H in Hancock is on the map, the fields of fire opens up, but at that point, then there's the possibility that your ground is dominated should the Confederates place artillery in the Peach Orchard, which you can also see on the map. And so those factors kind of start to come into play. You know, again, Dan Sickles, what makes the story fascinating is this guy is a character. You're trying to figure out how to sort out what is truth, what is lies, you know, and everything in between. Whether Sickles was confused by Meade's orders or he just didn't like them, and he'll give different versions of both, but whether he was confused or didn't like them, the bottom line, folks, is he makes the decision to move forward from where Meade wants him to be into what you see on the map represented by that blue line at Devil's Den, the wheat field, Peach Orchard, and Emmitsburg Road. I'm going to pause there. I'll let you interject.
Mate, yeah, so you've made some fantastic points there, and I always say, and you probably say the same thing, unless you actually stand on that battlefield and that ground and look at it, you'll never understand it. And again, you know, maps, you can have as many maps as you want. You're never going to understand the topography of that ground. And I mean, I've stood there not as many times as you on that peach orchard, and for me, it was the right decision, you know. So, you know, again, like you said, it's a little bit of an elevated ground. If he doesn't put his artillery there, they're going to put their artillery there. You know, you can see his thinking. One of the things that always comes up, and I'm sure you have this question all the time, I know you do, is does Chancellorsville have anything to do with it and Hazel Grove?
Yeah, absolutely. That is certainly part of the great debate. And, you know, I don't I'll clarify for anybody who is listening and maybe is not as familiar with my work. Um, I don't take the stance that Sickles made the right decision, because you often get this gulf between military people who will say just follow the damn order versus more of a civilian mentality will say, well, wait a minute, there's a lot of extenuating circumstances here, which again to me symbolizes the difference between a military man Meade and a civilian like Sickles. But back to the Hazel Grove Chancellorsville thing. The interesting thing is, if you read all of Sickles's post-war accounts, why did he do what he did? He does mention Chancellorsville a lot, and there's no doubt about that. What he often refers to at Chancellorsville, though, is the idea of being on the flank of the army and his fear of being outflanked. So it's almost like he's more reliving the nightmare that occurred to Oliver Howard versus Stonewall Jackson at Chancellorsville. I've never found, and I know other friends and colleagues who would say the same, I've never found an account where Sickles said, I did this because of Hazel Grove at Chancellorsville. But if you stand on the ground, it's a logical assumption that a lot of people make. The two battles are only 2 months apart. For anyone who doesn't know the story, at Hazel Grove, he was in a salient in front of the main Union line, very much what would look like the peach orchard on this map here. But at Hazel Grove, Chancellorsville, he was out in front of the main line. Hooker ordered Sickles to fall back. Sickles obeyed orders. He fell back. Confederate artillery came into the Hazel Grove position and basically pounded the heck out of the Union Army at Chancellorsville. May 3rd, 1863. Now we're on July 2nd, 1863. It's a very similar situation in reverse. We can look at it and say, God, Sickles has got to be thinking about that, but he never said it. And as a historian, you wish you had a couple of those accounts where he's in the record where he said, yes, I did this because of Hazel Grove. What he did say, though, is that he was concerned if the Confederates, with their artillery, could occupy not only the Peach Orchard, but much of that Emmitsburg Road Ridge line. If they could do that, he was worried his line was vulnerable. And again, in a lot of ways, that's saying Hazel Grove without saying Hazel Grove. So artillery and high ground and all of that definitely does come into play in his decision making.
Yeah, great points. Yeah. And so again, do you think he made the right decision? Sorry, I can't remember what you said.
Yeah. So I often try to defer from that. So it's funny, when I wrote the Sickles book, 2009, I definitely did not want to say that. I thought that field was so biased by people throwing their opinions out there. I wanted to stay away from it. When I did kind of the follow-up book to that in 2019, when Britt Eisenberg and I did Gettysburg Speech Orchard, 10 years had gone by. I'd done a ton of talks, a ton of battlefield programs. And I was a little more, what's the word I'm looking for? A little more willing to kind of express an opinion than maybe I was 10 years earlier. I don't think Sickles made the right decision, only because of the results. And the results, he basically moves into this position without Meade's knowledge. Meade will elect to reinforce the left with parts of the Second Corps, parts of the Fifth Corps, parts of the Sixth Corps. And even with the reinforcements, Sickles will struggle to hold the line and lose the position. So I don't think you have to go into all these crazy what-if scenarios that people like to throw out there or that you see on social media. I mean, the result is what it is. He took the position, he lost it. That's kind of your result. The only other thing I'll add is some critics will think his move helped the Confederate Army. And no, I didn't say that either, because I think Longstreet will ultimately chew up a good portion of Hood and McLaus's divisions, fighting for what the end result will tell us is kind of meaningless ground. So I don't think it helps. It certainly doesn't help Meade. I don't think it helps Lee and Longstreet at all. And I think it's one of those tragic things you see in combat where, guess what, folks? It doesn't really help either side. And obviously a lot of people will pay the price for that. But it's whether it helped or hurt anybody, this is, to me, the story of the second day at Gettysburg. Everyone focuses on the little round top and the 20th Maine and all of that stuff. No, Sickles has moved forward, whether you like him, and I'm not asking you to like him, Whatever you think of it, though, understanding the Sickles move to me is what drives the second day at Gettysburg. And to me, that's what makes it important. It also bleeds into the third day as well. And maybe we'll talk about that a little bit too.
Yeah, actually, you've made me think about it differently now. Yeah. But yeah, some really great points, really great points. And from what I understand as well, he was quite, they were spread out quite thinly. Is that right as well?
Yeah, that's one of the challenges. Kind of looking at that map, the original position that Sickles is in, give or take, the Third Corps has got about 10,500 men, give or take. Sickles would often say, look, the position General Meade wanted me to be in, I did not have enough men to defend. That may or may not be true, but by moving forward, he moved into a position that was really twice as long. And like you said there, and that really spreads him out, creates a lot of gaps in the line, which is going to make it critical for those reinforcements that come in from Meade. Again, to me, what makes the story interesting is the character of Dan Sickles. So what does he say afterwards? People say, well, Sickles, if you thought that, why did you move into a position that was twice as long? Remember, he's an attorney, he's a politician, he knows how to spin a story, and he would come back and he would say stuff like, oh, General Meade promised me reinforcements, and I had to hold the line until General Meade's reinforcements got there. So it was often the way he spun it, and, in a lot of ways damaged the historiography, but he could spin the story to make these excuses and kind of rationalize what he did.
And again, if you think about it, Warren comes along, doesn't he? Sees the issue, and that's when they, reinforce the round tops. Isn't that right?
Yeah, that is essentially right. So at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, by that time, Sickles had moved forward. The heavy fighting has not started yet, although there's definitely inklings that Longstreet is moving into position. But about 3 o'clock, Warren had gone up the Little Round Top, saw the Third Corps was out in front, not where they expected him to be. And you're right, it was Warren who went back to headquarters, told Meade, we got a problem on the left. Sickles at that time arrived at headquarters for a planned meeting. And, at that point, Meade basically just says, okay, don't even get off your horse. Let's go take a look and see what you've done. And 3:30 in the afternoon is really the first time Meade goes out to visit his left and realizes the magnitude of how General Sickles has interpreted his orders.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah. Okay, so we are going to talk about Longstreet quickly now, because again, It's always said that he drags his heels on that second day. And everyone criticizes him for that. So I want to know your opinion on that and your view on whether he does drag his heels on the second day at Gettysburg, or whether there's other things in play,
Yeah, you're right. You're right. There is a lot of play. And I don't think, he made the comment that everybody criticizes Longstreet for being slow. I don't think that's true anymore. I think Meade and Longstreet both are undergoing a renaissance of their image these days. And really, I think if you look at the Gettysburg literature, again, for the past 30, 35 years, most of what comes out is actually pro-Longstreet and pro-Meade. There are exceptions. I mean, there's exceptions to everything. But I think for the most part today, the general opinion isn't necessarily that Longstreet was slow or that he dragged his feet or anything like that. I don't personally think, July 2nd is Longstreet's best day of the American Civil War. I don't know if anybody would argue with me on that. I don't think so much that he's slow or dragging his feet. It takes him a few hours to get into position prior to the assault, primarily because there seems to be some miscommunication, I think, maybe between him and a staff officer or three. They have the famous counter march where he's trying to navigate his way through the back country and trying to find a way where he can get into position without being seen by some signal officers on the round tops and things of that nature. So it takes him a while. There's no doubt it takes him a while to get into position. I don't necessarily think he's slow or dragging his feet. I do think there are moments during that march when he could have been more diligent about getting up in front and saying, this is where we're going, let's go, kind of thing. And I do think there's some indication that he probably tries to defer some at times to other people, which obviously is not keeping with the spirit of Lee's old war horse that, again, we see on so many other battlefields.
I love your point about back in the past these guys used to get a bad rap, but there they are. I mean, I really like Longstreet, always have done. But like you said, some people were against him at some point, weren't they? But yeah. And again, people don't realise that how big these armies are. They're not that easy to move, are they? Let's be honest.
Exactly. No, that's exactly right, and I'm glad you said that because you're right. Yeah, he's coming in with two divisions, 14,000 guys or so, whatever the number is, artillery, wagons, all this stuff that goes with it. And again, people look at it on a map and a book and just say, "Well, why didn't he turn around and go this way and go that way?" Sort of thing. You
Yeah.
don't appreciate how big these columns are, and again, very often moving through what we would consider today to be very narrow roads, sometimes country lanes or that sort of thing. You just can't turn on a dime, and it takes these guys time to get where they need to go.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, like, look at the Army of Tomac, say, for instance. At one point, it was 120,000, and my brain just can't process the, logistics that goes into that. I can't get my head around it. I never have been able to. But yeah, it's a really interesting part of the Civil War that people forget
Hmm.
about. You
Hmm.
know, so.
Hmm. We do the same thing. Obviously, you guys have your sports and your stadiums, and you're over there. Often try to get people to relate to that and say, look, think of and I'll use an American football, but think of an American football stadium filled with 40,000 people or 60,000 people or 70,000 people, whatever the number is. And very often that still wouldn't cover these entire armies. You're right. It's hard for us to get our heads around that and to visualize that. What would that look like to see that many people on the march?
Well, yeah, I think it would be goosebumps. That's what it would be, Jim.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Anyway, let's talk about the actual attack now. So,
Okay.
talk us through what happens. So, is it around about 4 p.m. that the attack or Longstreet gets into position?
Yeah, 4 o'clock is usually the generally accepted time that we use. And again, probably in position a little bit before that. He's got a lot of artillery along that battle line where they're sort of starting off from what we would call today Seminary Ridge and Warfield Ridge. A lot of artillery, but usually about 4 o'clock is when we say the attack starts. This is where it can sometimes get muddy. And again, sometimes people's biases about Longstreet or Sickles can kind of interfere with what happens. But what I think happens is, first of all, when Longstreet gets his troops ready, Lafayette McLaws, division commander, John Bell Hood, division commander, by the time Longstreet finishes his countermarch and starts to get ready to deploy to the attack, Sickles has already moved forward. So the left flank of the Army of the Potomac is not where the Confederates expected to be. It's too far forward. It's not shaped like where they thought it was going to be, and it seems to be longer and extends further south than where the Confederates expected it to be. So the Union left doesn't resemble anything Longstreet expects, and because of that, there was sort of a general idea that if the attack had swung not necessarily up the Emmitsburg Road, but directionally up the Emmitsburg Road, they would have hit a short Union left flank and would have eventually taken the Union Army in flank. Because that doesn't happen, Longstreet has to redeploy his troops. Hood's division, which it looks like is not necessarily on this map, but Hood's division is going to go further to the Confederate right. And when they begin the attack, instead of kind of sweeping up the Emmitsburg Road, Hood's guys are basically going to move towards the Round Tops and Devil's Den. So instead of kind of an attack that goes northeast, let's say south to northeast, they're going to kind of have an attack here that's going to kind of go west to east. And because of that, they're going to get bogged down at the Round Tops. Longstreet's attack is going to ultimately lose a lot of the depth that he might have hoped for, and Longstreet is going to be attacking across a much broader front than he would have expected to attack. And what you see on the map here is are the Confederate brigades, particularly the front line brigades under William Barksdale and Joseph Kershaw. In McLaws's division, Kershaw will step off. He will primarily get bogged down in the wheat field, but also some of his guys will get hit by artillery in and around the Wheatfield Road and the Peach Orchard area. So the initial hour, 90 minutes or so, this Confederate attack are not going that well. But when William Barksdale's Mississippi Brigade, 4 regiments, about 1,600 men, step off, they're going to hit Sickles's Peach Orchard position more or less head on. And Sickles's Peach Orchard position is what we call the salient in his line. It's in front of everybody else, and it is kind of, as you can see on the map, they're facing in 2 directions. Because the line is stretched out, long story short, Barksdale is going to exploit some gaps in that position and basically just break this salient line open and more or less collapse Sickles's front along the Emmitsburg Road. So it's the key part of Sickles's position. Again, Barksdale spearheading the attack eventually will cause it to collapse. And by about 6 o'clock, 6:30, whatever time you want to put on it, Sickles's forward line is in serious trouble and starting to fall back and stream back towards Cemetery Ridge, where George Meade, again, has scrambled to put in other reinforcements where he can find them.
Mm-hmm. And Barksdale is killed during the attack, is that right?
He is. He mortally wounded as he presses on past the Peach Orchard and the Emmitsburg Road. And again, a great example of how being on the field is so different than looking at it on a map. Because if you look at it on the map right now, Barksdale's guys will push back where Sickles' headquarters is at the Trossel Barn and continue on to Cemetery Ridge, which is kind of more towards the right-hand side of the map. If you look at it on a map, it doesn't look like a big deal. If you get out on the battlefield and you try walking that in July heat, it's a huge deal. And so as Barksdale's guys continue to push east towards Cemetery Ridge, they start to get scattered. They start to, exhaustion starts to set in, but Barksdale wants to keep pressing and pushing when ultimately, as we said, Barksdale is mortally wounded, taken back to a field hospital, a Union field hospital, ironically, where he will succumb to his injuries.
And what I love about the Battle of Gettysburg, like many other people, is there's so much going on, and people, I think some people maybe don't know that there's so much going on the 2nd of July. You've got Corpse Hill as well going on, haven't you? You've got the Round Tops being attacked. So they're like little mini battles within a battle, aren't they? You know?
Yeah, they are. And, people often say that, and you're absolutely right. And look, that's obviously why it makes the story so fascinating, right? Everybody has sort of their niche that they're interested, if they're into. The flip side of that, though, is also true, and people often don't think about that, is how interrelated all of this is. The wheat field and the peach orchard, very interrelated. Some of the same troops fight in both areas. Artillery, kind of spanning the ground in both areas. Meade having to take reinforcements from Culp's Hill on the right to reinforce the left. So you're right, there's a lot going on, a lot to unpack, battles within battles, but also it's all related. And if you pull the thread out on one, you don't know how that might have changed the outcome of the other.
I'd love to be in Meade's mind during this, because you've been in charge for what, 2 or 3 days, and you've got all this huge battle going on, and people probably coming up to him and shouting at him and running, cannons going off, and it must have been mayhem. I don't know how he concentrated.
Yeah, sending staff officers in every direction.
What I mean. Yeah, I mean,
all of that stuff. It was it's been said that July 2nd is really George Meade's crisis management moment. Kent Masterson Brown is a friend of mine and wrote Meade at Gettysburg, kind of a nice counterpoint to Sickles at Gettysburg, if you want to get both sides of it. Although Kent advocates for his subject more than I advocate for mine, but Kent kind of calls it Meade's crisis management moment, and I think that description kind of really hits it right on the head. Think about it. Look, you've had one of your corps commanders go where he's not supposed to go. You've got this sledgehammer attack from Longstreet coming right at you. The fact that Meade could hold it together is a testament to him. It's a testament to the fighting abilities of the Army of the Potomac, but it's also a testimonial to the strength of his position, in my opinion. That fish hook, what we call today a fish hook. During the battle, nobody said rally around the fish hook. It's a modern kind of convention that we put on it. But the strength of the position, the interior lines, the ability to get reinforcements from point A to point B, in a lot of ways, in my opinion, does save the Northern Army's bacon.
Yeah, definitely, 100%. Okay, so something really, really big is going to happen as well, isn't it, at the Trussell farm, and that is Dan's wounding. So, would you like to tell us about that, please?
Yeah, something big, the critical moment of the no, but
Yeah, no, I'm joking.
yeah, so the Trussell farm that has served as Sickles's headquarters for much of the afternoon. After moving forward, at some point, again late afternoon, geez, I forget the time on it, but Sickles has an entry in one of his notebooks. I want to say sometime after 6 o'clock was about when he sort of timed it, but give or take, sometime in that ballpark, a Confederate artillery projectile comes soaring in. Yeah, probably an overshot. Who knows? Solid shot. Sickles is on his horse near the barn at the Trussell farm, and that projectile smashes into his right leg. He quickly realized, kind of glances off of him from the descriptions of it, doesn't even strike the horse. So if you're kind of envisioning one of these scenarios where the horse gets killed and the rider goes down, no, it's nothing like that. Kind of glances off of him. And so Sickles realizes he's been badly injured. He puts his hand on his leg. He realizes it's blood. He realizes his leg is no longer functioning. And he sort of slides off his horse. Staff officers and such put him next to the barn. He's quickly going into shock because of blood loss. They probably take a cigar out of his pocket and light him up for what good New York general doesn't love a good cigar in 1863? So they put the cigar in his mouth. Probably a little of what they call stimulants that they pump into him to try to get him out of shock. But they're waiting for an ambulance to come. Shells are starting to fall everywhere. More and more Third Corps troops are starting to stream back from the Emmitsburg Road. Legend tells us that Sickles kind of puts the cigar in his mouth as he's being carried off the field and says, don't worry, boys, I'll be back. Your general is coming back, sort of thing. To me, that was always one of the great Dan Sickles moments. I mean, the leg is shattered and you're bleeding and you're just kind of smoking the cigar. I mean, it was a great Sickles moment. Kind of when I did my Sickles book, I grudgingly came to the conclusion that legend was probably more myth than reality, which is a shame. Sometimes, what's that old adage? Don't meet your heroes. Well, sometimes, you torpedo your own favorite stories, kind of thing. But anyways, he's taken off the field, taken to a field hospital along the Baltimore Pike, where his leg will be amputated that evening. Effectively, there we go, effectively ending his military career, but really it's just another phase in the legend of Dan Sickles. And the diamond monument that you're looking at there is the site kind of above the Trussell barn where it generally believed the wounding occurred, and you see an image of him taken not too long afterwards, with obviously his right leg missing.
Okay, I know you said that they were completely overrun anyway, but does this have any morale effect on his guys in the Third Corps?
You mean, does his wounding have a morale effect?
Yeah, and being taken off the field and not being there.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think probably for the limited number of people who saw it and realized it, I do think there was probably an element of, oh, look, General Sickles, he's been taken off. Don't worry, General. We'll hold the line. I think there's a little bit of it going on. Probably the average rank and file guy would have simply had no idea until later on. Really, at that point, holding the Third Corps together kind of falls into the hands of Division Commander Birney of the 1st Division, Division Commander Humphreys of the 2nd Division. And Birney will give an order to Humphreys basically saying, okay, fall back and connect with me. We're going to get out of here. We're going to fight our way back to Cemetery Ridge. Humphreys, who, by the way, is the only West Pointer in the Third Corps command chain, will pull back. And when he pulls back, Birney's line is disintegrated. There is no line to connect with, as all of Birney's guys are kind of heading to the back. So I think there's probably a mix of a lot of emotions going on. Certainly accounts of guys more or less panicked and saying, "Run, boys, we're whipped," kind of thing. But certainly in Humphreys' division, we have accounts of General Humphreys forcing his men to turn around and kind of do a fighting withdrawal. So probably a mix of a lot of things.
So again, once they do this fighting withdraw, where do they congregate after that? Because do the Confederates run out of steam at that point when they get to the Peach Orchard?
Yeah,
Um,
good question. What they do is they tend to congregate back towards Cemetery Ridge, very much in the area that Sickles was supposed to be in the first place. And if you want to needle Sickles a little bit, you can say,
yeah,
great, his guys retreated back to where we wanted him to be anyways.
irony.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, so very much back towards Cemetery Ridge. Bernie's division in particular seems to be fairly shot up. And I think there's one account where Bernie says, hey, we're going into the woods to make coffee. We're done today. Humphreys stays on the field and will actually rally some of his guys and even counterattack back towards the Emmitsburg Road and recapture a little bit of ground in some batteries. But to the second part of your question, yeah, by this point, Longstreet's attack is starting to run out of steam. They've covered ground. They've fought their way through ground. It's getting late. A lot going on. And again, a lot of these Union reinforcements, some of these, the 1st Minnesota, George Willard's brigade, who stops Barksdale. Freeman McGilvery of the artillery sets up an artillery line. A lot of this stuff kind of helps the Confederates run out of steam, and eventually Longstreet's attack ultimately does end, and he has to pull them back without the great success against the Union left that Lee and Longstreet had hoped for.
And another thing that has just popped into my head, I understand that the weather was extremely warm that day as well. So did that play any factor in that? Because I mean, it would have done for the guys going up round tops, if you haven't got enough water
Sure.
or.
Sure. Yeah, I'm sure it didn't help. Yeah, the temperature in July 2nd was the recorded temperature at midday was like 82 of our degrees or something like that, 82 Fahrenheit. And so it certainly wouldn't have it certainly wouldn't have helped. And again, you think about these guys fighting out there in the uniforms and with all the gear and the accoutrements and all that stuff. It's really amazing. You mentioned Goosebumps before. I mean, it's really amazing to think about how what the hardships these guys could go through.
Yeah, you don't understand it. You never
Yeah,
understand.
yeah, you really don't.
Yeah.
We really don't, right?
No. Okay, I want to bring up this point, and you're going to like this picture because you'll know what it is, and I'm not going to say anything. You're just going to tell the story. How about
That sounds good. There you go.
that?
Yeah, Dan Sickles' leg. I will often I use maps and photos when I do my battlefield tours, and I'll often kind of dramatically whip it out and say, "Here is General Sickles' severed leg," and
Love
and,
it.
and people seem to enjoy that. Yeah, so the leg is amputated at a field hospital that night, effectively ending Sickles' military career. Certainly, his battlefield career is over by the close of July 2nd, 63. But anyways, he is taken to Washington then to recuperate. And while he goes to Washington, one of the first people he meets and talks with is President Lincoln. And Sickles almost immediately meets with Lincoln and seems to start repivoting, spinning the Battle of Gettysburg to this idea that George Meade had not wanted to fight and wanted to retreat, and that Sickles had moved forward to bring on the battle. And this is sort of the final phase of Sickles's career, the one-legged war hero trying to reposition himself and not George Meade or others as the hero of Gettysburg. So the leg was donated to a medical museum in Washington. It is said, and I think it's got to be at least a little apocryphal, but it is said Sickles would often visit his severed leg on the anniversary of the battle. People always seem to like that story. But the general idea is from here on out, he is going to reposition himself as this hero, this guy who lost a limb defending the Union kind of thing. And the veterans love that kind of talk. So he will be, for the rest of his life, popular at veterans reunions and gatherings and monument dedications and all of that stuff. At the same time, in October of 63, when he is recovered enough to come back to the Army of the Potomac, Meade can use the missing leg to say, General Sickles, I'm sorry. I just don't think you're in the physical condition you need to be to command a corps. And Meade kind of uses that as the excuse or at least the excuse that he says to prevent Sickles from coming back to the army. So a lot going on with that leg, folks. Look closely at it.
And can you actually still go and see that now? Is that right?
It is. It's been moved around. For many years it was at Walter Reed. And that's a museum that a lot of people still have in their head that it is at. It is actually today at a National Museum of Health and Medicine, which is down in Silver Spring, Maryland. So, folks, if any of you are down in the Silver Spring area, there's an actual medical museum, a whole lot of other exhibits, sports injuries, and all kinds of stuff. But yeah, Sickles' leg is still there. It's been a couple years since I've been down to see it. I suppose I should go back and pay my regards, but
And you're
it's
not
still
that
there.
far there, Jim, are you, really?
No, it's just finding the time to get down there.
Yeah,
You know,
no,
you
no, yeah.
you get near DC, you get into the
Yeah.
traffic, all that stuff. It's
I've
just a
heard, yeah, well, I've actually been on the 95, but I know it's quite bad, isn't it? Is it the I-95?
yeah, it could be right.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, Dan is important for this next thing, and that is his involvement in the foundation of Gettysburg National Battlefield. So just tell us a little bit about his involvement there and how that all comes about.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Just for a second, when I wrote the book, I kind of did the book in three phases. At least in my head, I did pre-Gettysburg, Gettysburg, and then after Gettysburg. Well, the idea was the factors leading up to Gettysburg, what he did at Gettysburg in phase two, because that's what we remember him for. But this third phase, which included battlefield preservation, establishing Gettysburg National Military Park, I can say from experience, this phase was foreign to a lot of people. A lot of people didn't know this. They just heard Sickles was a bad man and he disobeyed General Meade and he nearly lost the war and blah, 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 all that stuff. This phase was one that a lot of people didn't know about. And it's kind of long. I'll try, like everything, it's kind of long. I'll try to answer it succinctly. But so the idea, first of all, is by the late 1870s, early 1880s, veterans are starting to get more involved in the preservation of battlefields such as Gettysburg. Well, in the mid 1880s, Sickles gets elected as chairman of what we call the New York Monuments Commission, which, among other things, raises money and places monuments on battlefields such as Gettysburg. So now he's in an official position where he can go to battlefields, probably get a all expense paid trip, so nothing comes out of his pocket. But kind of go to these battlefields, put your stamp on the history of the battlefield. Okay. No, we the New York Monuments Commission says we were here, put the monument here. That's a big deal in terms of how we remember it. And of course, gives speeches to cheering veterans. And one of his topics will be, I don't want to say anything bad about George Meade, but, and then kind of go into this story about how Meade didn't want to fight and, Sickles moved forward. And he replays that stuff over and over and over for years. And a lot of the veterans like it. A lot of veterans and people don't like the story because they think him and his cronies are kind of perverting history. So you kind of have this a little bit of a mixed bag there. But a lot of the veterans love the guy. He's a good story. He talks well. He's got whiskey. He's got cigars, maybe some prostitutes with him. Who wouldn't love that, right? And so he's got all that going on. Anyways,
Yes.
now I'm going to fast forward to the 1890s. So in the
Please
18
do, yeah.
yeah, in the 18 please do. In the 1890s,
I didn't mean it like that.
he goes back to Congress. He goes back to Congress and he introduces the legislation that we refer to as the Sickles Bill, which creates Gettysburg National Military Park. And notice how I paused there to try to make it more dramatic. Again, Sickles critics will say, bah, other people were more involved in preservation. Other people would have done it. That's not the point. He, with his name and his reputation, pushed through the enabling legislation that created Gettysburg National Military Park. So in a lot of ways, he is the father of the battlefield. You've put his image up here on screen of Sickles and his July 2nd opposite number, James Longstreet. And during this era, Sickles and Longstreet, during these gatherings and veterans reunions, they become friends and they're drinking friends and they go to events together and they mutually defended and supported each other for really the remainder of their lives. Longstreet more or less went to his grave saying he thought Sickles's move to the Peach Orchard helped the Union cause. Didn't hurt it, but helped it. Whether Longstreet believed it or not, folks, only Longstreet can tell us. But he was very supportive of Sickles till the end of his days, and they would go to veterans events together. There's a story we often tell where Sickles basically says, Longstreet, one of these days you're going to have to apologize for shooting my leg off. And Longstreet says, apologize. You should thank me for giving you one leg to still stand on. So there was a lot of that sort of banter for the remainder of these guys' lives, which again I think only enhances why this is an interesting story, because it's not just battle and tactics, folks. There's a lot of other stuff going on under the surface too.
Yeah, and that's that. I like the point of the fact that without him, this doesn't happen. And let's be honest, Gettysburg is probably one of the most popular tourist attractions in the United States. Is that right? Would you say that?
Well, I don't know whether it is or isn't one of the most popular attractions. We got Disneyland and Disney World and stuff like that, but certainly in terms of within the national park system and historic sites, Gettysburg is up there. Like a lot of history sites too. Obviously, numbers have dropped a little bit, more than a little bit in recent years, and we need people to come back and be more interested in
Mhm.
all of these topics.
Yeah, but I've been there 3 times myself, and I've just got to say,
Okay.
it's just such an amazing place. The first time I went there, it was just magical. For me, it's like Disneyland. It's Disneyland
Yeah.
for historians and Gettys buffs or whatever you want to call people that go to Gettysburg. But it's just so fantastic. It really is. So
Did you
Dan
just say?
Sickles, yeah,
Did
sorry,
you just?
go on.
I was
Sorry.
just gonna say. Did you say? I was just gonna. Did you say Getty's buffs? I kind of like that. I
Yeah,
don't know if I've heard that.
Gettys
Maybe
buffs. Yeah,
no,
Gettys.
coin that term.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off. I
That's
get
no,
accused of doing that
that's fine,
sometimes.
but I'm just saying, people, stop criticizing this poor man. He's done this for us. This we've got somewhere to go.
Very true. The
Yeah,
house that Dan Sickles built,
that's what I mean.
Gettysburg National Military Park.
Yeah, I
We'll
don't know
never
where I've
know.
got that saying from actually, Gaz Buff. So I might have nicked it off someone else. But if there's anybody that knows where that came from, please drop us a line and let us know. Okay. So just before we're going to get onto another topic in a minute, which is yourself. But if you could sum Dan Sickles up, his life and his career, what would you say about him?
That's an interesting question. I don't get that one a lot. I certainly think, to summarize, he was an interesting and colorful character that really was on the American stage for much of the 19th century, well into the 20th century. And I think the idea that you have a congressman, a defendant in a famous murder trial, a pivotal player at the Battle of Gettysburg, and a pivotal player in the subsequent development of Civil War battlefields here in America. I think when you put all of that together, whether you like him or not, whether you find his character interesting or not, you look at those accomplishments, and I certainly think he's a guy that should not be forgotten and is worthy of the story. And frankly, if you do Gettysburg without Dan Sickles, then I think you're missing a good chunk of Gettysburg's most colorful history and most important history. And as I said, I think those are the reasons why he should be remembered. Because I get a lot of people who are like, Dan Sickles, I don't like him. Kind of stuff. Again, not asking you to like him, but if you're interested in Gettysburg, I personally don't think you can ignore him.
No, definitely not. Okay, we're going to change a little bit now. We're going to talk about you, Jim,
Ooh,
because you've
okay.
had an interesting career and interesting life. And so I just said about my visits to Gettysburg. So my first visit to Gettysburg was in 2006, and the reason I went there is because I saw the movie. And of course, when I saw that, I didn't really know much about the history, so I knew nothing about Dan Sickles till I had a tour. Okay,
Okay.
so that's the first time I become or got to know Dan Sickles himself. But what about you? When was your first visit to Gettysburg, and was that the gateway drug that got you into the Civil War in Gettysburg?
Yeah. So my first visit to Gettysburg was probably around 1994. 1995, I'm going to say, maybe a little bit earlier than that, but it was the mid 1990s. As I alluded to kind of during that first question and answer, there he is. Yeah. Yeah, aging a little bit over the years. The weight goes up and down, but that's okay. Anyways, mid 90s, already interested in the Civil War. But yes, I had never been to Gettysburg. I had read The Killer Angels. I had seen the movie. I got to go to Gettysburg. And like so many people, I just got to Gettysburg. Now, the mid 1990s was the heyday of the movie, and it was
Yeah.
crowded. There were a lot of people here, and businesses seemed to be thriving. And just like, what an amazing place, this huge battlefield, and this great story, and this cool little town. And all of that really did sort of spike my interest, whet my appetite to where I was like, okay, I've been here. Now I really want to learn more about Gettysburg. And I started acquiring and gobbling up the books, and which ultimately led me to where I'm at now.
Yeah. Okay. So you became a licensed battlefield guide. When was that, and what did that entail? Was that was that your dream at one point? I suppose it was.
Yeah, so first part of that, so I took the exam in late 2002, scored very well. I was second in my class in the 2002 class, and then I passed what we have is the oral exam on my first attempt. So by the spring of 2003, I was guiding. So I think this is my 21st year, give or take. The exam itself, it's sort of legendarily notorious in Civil War circles for being how difficult it is. When I took it, it was basically a two-phased approach. You have an extensive written exam, fill in the blank, essay questions. They want to make sure you know the material and not just regurgitate it. It can cover all of the Civil War, not just Gettysburg. The top performers on the written exam go into then what we call the oral exam. And the oral exam is basically giving a mock tour to two examiners. The oral exam, for whatever reason, was always the thing that really stressed people out. I guess it just goes back to our everyone's inherent fear of public speaking at some level. But there was sort of that written exam, oral exam combination. Over the years, they've now added another phase, which is what they call the panel interview, where you have to go in and make sure you're likable and can relate to people and all of that stuff. It's a difficult exam. Having said that, it is not impossible to pass. The fact that we have these licensed battlefield guides and will continue to have them long after I'm gone, the fact that people do still pass the exam, though, does show you that, folks, if you're dedicated and committed, you can do it. Real quick, because I know you said I didn't answer the last part of it. Was it my dream? Not really. I kind of took it like a lot of people do to see how I would do. And then when I passed, I realized, oh my God, this was so difficult. I don't ever want to do this again. So I started doing tours and held on to the license. And the way I always looked at it was that I kind of attained my retirement job like 30 years earlier than I should have, kind of thing. So it's that's kind of how I looked at it anyways.
Brilliant, mate. Thank you for adding that. So we've got to talk about three really important things now, and that is obviously your books. So yeah, we've got to talk about your books, Jim, because they're amazing. And the Sickles at Gettysburg is the last one, isn't it, that you've done recently? Is that right? And then the other two are, sorry, you know better than me. Tell us.
Yeah. So Sickles at Gettysburg was actually the first one.
Oh, okay. Sorry, apologies.
And no worries. This stuff is always more important to the author than it is to the general public. Right? Most people know this stuff. Yeah, it's like your children. These are my three children.
Of course they are, yeah.
And I have two human children, by the way. So anyways, 2009, Sickles' book comes out. The Sickles book was a direct correlation to becoming a battlefield guide because I realized I liked telling Sickles stories, and I didn't feel like the Sickles books that were out at that time really told the story that I wanted to understand. So Sickles was first. In I'm trying to think of the year, 2012, 2013, whatever. Anyways, the second book was Pickett's Charge at Gettysburg, which I did with my good friend Wayne Motz. Everyone in the Civil War community knows Wayne. With the maps by Steve Stanley, who does the maps for the American Battlefield Trust. So Steve is well known too. So the three of us kind of pooled our resources, did this really cool color guide, Pickett's charge. You can use it on the field. You can use it at home. Really proud of that. Last but not least was Gettysburg's Peach Orchard, which I co-wrote with another guide and a friend, Britt Eisenberg. Britt and I both had interests in the story of the Peach Orchard in the Emmitsburg Road fight and the regiments that were there. And I felt like there were pieces that didn't quite belong in my Sickles book that could be in a Peach Orchard book. And so Britt and I did that. And so, well, it never turned out that way as an intent. I kind of view the Peach Orchard book as a sequel to the Sickles book. I'm thinking, who would do a sequel to a Dan Sickles book, right? But that was kind of how all three of those came along.
Okay. And is there going to be a trilogy of the Sickles ones?
I do kind of like George
You need to have a
Lucas.
trilogy, mate. Come on.
Yeah, with like George Lucas and Star Wars, I do kind of
Yeah.
jokingly refer to these as my Gettysburg trilogy. I'm actually working on a fourth one right now about the first day at Gettysburg. That'll be different in scope than these books, but yeah, I do sometimes jokingly refer to these as my trilogy.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Anyway, one more thing we really need to talk about is your fantastic podcast. And see, look, you can tell you're a podcaster because you just bang on. You know what you do. You know how it works, sort of thing. If you know what I mean. So tell us about your wonderful podcast.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So, my co-podcast with my longtime friend and fellow battlefield guide, Eric Lindblade, who you can see on the other side of the screen there. Within the last year or two, we've also added another friend, Jody Wilson, to also kind of give a different perspective on things. So Jim, Eric, Jody, we do the Battle of Gettysburg podcast. Geez, I don't know. I think we're in our fifth year right now, fifth year, or whatever it's been, and available for free. It is a free podcast. Anywhere you listen to fine podcasts, you should be able to find the Battle of Gettysburg podcast. The idea was Eric and I, when we kind of started this, we really wanted to do deep dives on all the different battle micro topics that people debate about, and we wanted to do a podcast. And then kind of each episode is just devoted to a topic. I appreciate your compliments. We've learned along the way and gotten better and tried some different approaches. It may be the only Civil War podcast that has a professional wrestling bent on it at times, which some people love. And
well, I like that because I grew up in the Attitude Era. So there you go.
Exactly. But all joking aside, folks, we really think it's the best deep dive on the Battle of Gettysburg out there. Obviously, we're biased on it, but we hope you'll give it a listen.
Yeah, and I'll put all the I'll put all the links in the description below for your books and for your podcast, Jim. But before we wrap this up, is there anything that I might have forgotten to say that you wanted to say?
I don't think so. I think the questions really covered the gamut from beginning to end, and the fact that you kind of gave us a closing summary. I'll just go back to what we've said, just so there's no misinterpretation here. The point of telling the Dan Sickles story is not to say, in my mind, it's not to say Sickles was right, Meade was wrong, or anything like that. Because as I say more clearly in the Peach Orchard book, I don't think Meade was wrong. I don't think he was. The results show that. But as I've said, Sickles is an interesting story and an important one to Gettysburg. And too many historians come in and kind of advocate for their topic. The third guy, I've fallen in love with my guy. You see too many biographers kind of do that and let bias kind of creep into it. And knock on wood, I've tried not to do that and just let the story tell itself. And at the end of the day, you can make up your own mind on it.
Okay, thank you, mate. And all that is left to say is thank you very much.
Thank you. No, thank you. No, this has been a lot of fun. I'm sure more time has gone by while I was talking than I realized. And thank you for the invite. And Chris Mikowski, who I know our friend, had something to do with the invite. So thanks to Chris. And couldn't have been happier to make your acquaintance. And hopefully this is the beginning of like Sickles and Longstreet, the beginning of a long friendship, right?
I think it definitely could be a bromance there, my friend. Anyway, cheers.
Cheers. Thanks.